Hello and welcome to Behind the Wall, your new weekly look at China and its complex relationships with Australia and the rest of the world. I'm Stan Grant. The highest grossing film of 2020 is an epic tale of overcoming oppression, a blockbuster battle of good versus evil and the fight for a nation. The Chinese film, The 800, recounts the story of outnumbered Chinese heroes holding out against Japanese forces during the Battle of Shanghai in 1937. It's also a slick piece of propaganda, the latest from a country that has mastered the use of films as a tool of manufacturing nationalism.
Your feet tread heavily on the ground. Have you a burden, grasshopper?
There was a time not that long ago when Chinese characters were played by white actors. David Carradine became a worldwide star playing a Shaolin monk in the 1970s. At the same time, Bruce Lee was breaking down barriers. The action-packed martial arts films made him the first Asian superstar. But in 2000, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon took kung fu films to a new level. Directed by Ang Lee, it made his name as a filmmaker. It was artistic and breathtaking to film, and its cast represented the cream of Chinese acting talent. With Mandarin dialogue, it became at the time the highest grossing foreign language film, reaping more than $200 million globally, and was nominated for 10 Academy Awards, a record at the time for a foreign film. As China's economy has grown, so has its film industry. It is an arm of China's soft power, a sort of diplomacy, China's face to the world. But at home, film has become a powerful tool of nationalism. Under Xi Jinping, filmmakers have turned to history, telling a narrative of triumph over adversity.
The Japanese are approaching from the north. It's beginning.
Avenging the humiliation of China by foreign powers. The Wolf Warrior films, celebrating an elite arm of the People's Liberation Army, became box office sensations.
Wolf Warrior.
Wolf Warrior diplomacy is now used to describe China's more assertive, even aggressive stance in the world. We have seen this before. China is taking a leaf out of America's book.
All hands, stand by for battle surface.
When Hollywood was conscripted as an arm of US propaganda, churning out post-World War II films celebrating American military glory.
Is John Wayne in the glory-rousing role of his career.
Now there is The 800, a film examining China's war against the Japanese. It is a dark period of China's history, a scar on the nation's soul. It also led to the Chinese Civil War and ultimately the Communist Revolution. The 800 is a film to stir patriotism, to tell of a great victory and remind the world China has returned to global power. So what can we learn from these films and how effective are they at shaping Chinese identity? Dr Delia Lin is a senior lecturer in Chinese studies at the University of Melbourne, and she joins me now. Delia, it's good to see you. Tell us why The 800 has been so successful.
Hello, Stan. Thanks for having me. It's not a surprise that it's so successful, The 800. And don't forget that China has just got back from coronavirus, and now in many cities in China, then people are going back to kind of normal life and going back to cinemas. And here right now, they need a boost of spirit, and I think that 800 can really offer that uplifting spirit, and so that they can feel a sense of belonging, can feel a sense of pride, and also that dramatic scene also would make them feel that to feel real, that feel that they have gone through a massive battle against the virus. So it's not a surprise that that it has become the highest grossing film in 2020.
And of course, Delia, it deals with such a sensitive time in Chinese history and a time that has very much shaped a contemporary Chinese identity, the war against Japan, seen as being the domination of foreign powers over the Chinese. Why does the war against Japan, why does that hover so heavily over China today and its identity?
Yes, because at the beginning of the war, that China, at that time it was Republic of China, was having a very, was fighting very hard. And in comparison to Japan, China was weak in terms of military powers. But then the Chinese fought very hard against it, and in the end they won it. So it is a story of pain. It is a journey of humiliation, and the story of how the Chinese could get together and fought this war, and in the end won the war and won their independent identity. So it is when a powerful foreign nation invaded the Chinese land, and how the people have suffered through the war, and then how they have defeated the enemy. So, and it was a very long time, 8 years, and that during that time, that how people did everything they could to succeed. So there was just too many stories to tell, and then of course many heroes that could be created throughout this story. Because when we shape national identity, don't forget that heroes were shaped out of it, and also the story could be told in so many different ways. And when people felt that suffering, then they would remember that period of humiliation. That would encourage them to work harder for the future.
But Delia, the subject itself is very complex, and I know that there was actually some controversy around this film. Its release date was pushed back because of the way that it was being depicted. There were two forces fighting, weren't there? There were the Kuomintang, the nationalists, and also the communists, who ultimately came to a communist revolution and came to rule China. But what was the controversy here around the way that this was being depicted? And why did the Chinese Communist Party today initially have an issue with the film?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very good question, because actually anti-Japan war is a very difficult story to tell for the Communist Party, because at the time, at the beginning, it was the Republic of China that was the legitimate government, and it was the Kuomintang, the nationalist army, that was the legitimate army. And how does the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, claim credit for this war? That's really a difficult question. So the narrative of the war has been very carefully crafted in China, in textbooks and in museums, to make the audience, to make the spectators actually feel that it is the Communist Party who should claim the credit of for the ultimate victory.
But in this case, so you have on the one hand a propaganda that says it was the Communist Party that defeated Japan. But in this case, there is also a recognition, isn't there, of the nationalist forces, because it was the nationalist Kuomintang forces who were fighting the Japanese in this particular battle in Shanghai in 1937.
Yeah, and that was exactly why the film has created so many controversies in the beginning last year. Exactly why the film was not released as planned last year. There was because, in fact, in 1975, Taiwan also released a film based on the same story, because it was an extraordinary story. And it's also one of the few wars in the world that you actually had civilian spectators watching the war on the other side of the river. So it was very special in many different ways. And certainly it was a film that you could really create heroes, and the actions of the soldiers were absolutely heroic. They knew that they were there to sacrifice their lives, but they wanted to show the world that they were persistent, and they were ready to fight, and they were ready to give their lives. So in many ways, it was a spectacular story to tell. But in Taiwan in 1997, the film, I watched the trailer. The biggest story of the film was, if you watch the trailers of both both narratives of the same story, you could actually see different narratives. And in the Taiwan narrative, it was about celebration of the Republic of China.
Very politically sensitive. Now, how does this film differ from the Wolf Warrior films? Because the Wolf Warrior films are much more like the Rambo type film. They are much more about the power of the People's Liberation Army. They are much more about Chinese power, about patriotism and nationalism, aren't they?
Absolutely. So I would say that 800 is a very different movie to War Warriors. And War Warriors is, from an Australian perspective, it's a blatant propaganda machine. It was set on a military stage, but there was no military tactics, and it was just to manufacture patriotism and nationalism, and to celebrate the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. But it was hugely, both movies, the War Warriors 1 and 2, were hugely successful in China. And it's very interesting to see that, because that really poses the question, why were they successful? And why it was, how they successfully portrayed patriotism and nationalism through the movies, and why do people like them?
Delia, what is the message to the world that China wants to send right now? With these films, with this sense of nationalism, with this display of strength, what is China saying to the world?
Well, let's look at War Warriors, because I think they're really good representations of the way that China wants the world to see itself, and also the way that China sees itself in the world as well, and also how China would like its citizens or the spectators to see the world through those films. War Warriors, the two films, War Warrior 1 and 2, this common thread going into the films is seeing the world in basically black and white worldview. And in other words, in specific, it's black and white moral judgment of the world. The West is evil and China is benevolent. And those two movies crafted that very well. That black and white moral judgment. And that's based on a reading of West, a reading and portrayal of West and China. People know that they're patriotic movies, but they feel that the spirit gets uplifted from it.
Delia, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you again for bringing us your insights. Thank you.
Thank you.